So today we are going to start chapter 12 of our textbook, which is going to be our lymphatic system and our immune system. So the lymphatic system is going to consist of two parts. There are a network of lymphatic vessels that are going to transport lymph throughout our bodies. And then we're going to have lymphoid tissues and organs that are scattered throughout our body tissues. The lymphatic vessels transport fluids that escape the vascular system back to the blood. And the lymphoid organs are going to house things like phagocytic cells and lymphocytes, which are going to play an important role in our body defenses and the way we're able to resist disease. So here we can see the way that the lymphatic system is situated with the circulatory system. So in our last chapter, we looked at the cardiovascular system where we have the heart, we have arteries that are going to carry blood away from the heart. That leads to capillaries where we get oxygen and nutrient exchange, and then that lower oxygen content blood is transferred back to the heart. So what happens is we have these lymphatic vessels, and the lymphatic vessels do not carry blood. They carry a fluid called lymph, and lymph is basically the fluid that escapes the circulatory system. So every time your heart beats, it pushes the blood against the walls of the blood vessels. Well, in our capillaries, the blood vessels become kind of porous and kind of leaky, so it pushes some of the fluid out and it creates a fluid called interstitial fluid. And interstitial fluid is going to carry nutrients and oxygen to the tissue cells that are not in direct contact with the blood capillary. Well, that fluid that's pushed out, that interstitial fluid that is created, some of it has to be returned back to circulation, otherwise the tissues would just continue to fill with fluid and they would start to swell up. Well, we have these lymphatic capillaries that are interwoven with the blood capillaries, and their job is to pick up that excess fluid and transport it back to the heart. And as it makes its way back to the heart, it travels through these little bean-shaped structures that are called lymph nodes. And the lymph nodes are going to filter any microbes or debris or any pathogens that are in that lymph, so that by the time we dump that lymph back into the heart, it is going to be well cleansed. So let's look at our lymphatic vessels first. With each contraction of the heart, when we force the blood or eject the blood from the heart, that blood is going to travel through our circuitry of arteries. Now, some of the fluid that is part of the blood is going to be pushed out of the arterial end of the capillary, but most of it is going to be resorbed on the venous side of the capillary. So where we enter the capillary, the net force is to push some of the fluid out, but as we make our way through the capillary, we're going to suck some of that fluid back in. The fluid that remains behind in the tissue spaces becomes part of our interstitial fluid, and that can be as much as 3 liters of fluid that are produced each day. The lymphatic vessels are going to pick up that excess fluid. Once it's inside of the vessels, we refer to it as lymph, and then it returns it back to the bloodstream. Now, lymphatic vessels are going to form a one-way system where we're only moving lymph towards the heart. We never move lymph away from the heart. Lymphatic capillaries form kind of a spider web between tissue cells and blood capillaries in loose connective tissue. And these very permeable lymphatic capillaries are capable of absorbing that fluid that's leaked from the blood capillaries. Things like proteins and larger particles like cell debris, bacteria, and viruses are normally prevented from entering blood capillaries, but they can enter lymphatic capillaries, particularly in areas where we are experiencing inflammation. So this is a diagram that shows us the way that blood capillaries and lymphatic capillaries are intertwined with one another. So we have the arteriolar end of the capillary where the blood flows into the capillary. As it makes its way through the capillaries, we're going to drop off oxygen and nutrients, pick up carbon dioxide and waste products, and we're going to drain into a venule. Now, the sheer force of your heart beating pushes some of the fluid portion of the blood out of the blood capillary, and it bathes our tissues as interstitial fluid. So that fluid has to be picked back up and returned to circulation, otherwise the tissues would just continue to swell. So these little green tubes that you see are the lymphatic capillaries. So they are interwoven with the blood capillaries, and they are much more porous than a blood capillary. And they can pick up that excess fluid, the cellular debris, the microorganisms. They can pick those up and they can transport those through our lymphatic vessels to the lymph nodes where that lymph will be cleansed before we dump it back into circulation near the heart. So this is what a lymphatic capillary looks like. So a lymphatic capillary isn't like a blood capillary. A blood capillary is like a web, right? Where you have an artery that feeds blood into the web, and then you have a vein that drains the blood from the web. A lymphatic capillary just starts off as like a blind sac, right? It's just these like finger-like tubes that are all interwoven with our blood capillaries. And the cells that make up those lymphatic capillaries are pretty loosely joined. And so they form these little mini valves so that when the interstitial fluid starts to build up, it creates hydrostatic pressure that allows for those cells to kind of separate, and then the interstitial fluid flows into the lymphatic capillary. Once it's in the lymphatic capillary, we just call it lymph, right? It's plasma when it's in blood vessels, it's interstitial fluid when it bathes the tissues, and then when it moves into the lymphatic capillary, we're going to call it lymph. So lymph travels through lymph nodes where it's cleansed of debris and it's examined by cells of the immune system. The lymph is going to be transported in successively larger and larger lymphatic vessels until it is returned to venous circulation through one of two large ducts that we find in the thoracic region. One of those ducts is called the right lymphatic duct, and the right lymphatic duct is going to drain lymph from the right arm, the right side of the head and the neck, and the right side of the chest. It's going to dump its lymph into the right subclavian vein. The other large duct that is going to receive lymph is called the thoracic duct. And the thoracic duct is going to drain everything on the left-hand side of the body, as well as the right side of the body below the diaphragm. So the right lymphatic duct only drains the right side above the diaphragm. Thoracic duct is going to drain everything else. Now, like the veins of the cardiovascular system, lymphatic vessels are thin-walled, and the larger ones are going to have little valves. And those little valves are just like the ones that we saw in the veins, where they're little flaps of tunica intima that point in the direction of lymph flow. The lymphatic system is a pretty low pressure system, right? And there's no pump. There's no separate heart to move the lymph through the lymphatic vessels. So instead, lymph is going to be transported by some of the same mechanisms that are going to help in the return of venous blood to the heart. We're going to have that milking action of skeletal muscles, right? So when the skeletal muscles contract, it kind of squeezes the lymph through those lymphatic vessels, and the valves, the lymphatic valves, are going to help prevent the backflow. We also have pressure changes that occur in the thorax. So when you breathe in, the pressure in your chest drops. And what happens is it kind of pulls the lymph up through those large ducts and helps to dump it back into venous circulation. Also, lymphatic vessels have a little bit of smooth muscle associated with their walls. Not a lot, not like an artery, but there is a little bit. So that smooth muscle that's in the wall of lymphatic vessels can contract a little bit to kind of help move that lymph along. So here we can see the way that the lymphatic vessels and the lymph nodes are going to be set up. So what you see shaded in green on the left side of the picture, but is the right side of the patient's body, is the entire region that is drained by our right lymphatic duct. So everything that's shaded in green is going to be drained of its lymph by the right lymphatic duct. Everything that's in red is going to be drained by our thoracic duct. And then that fluid is going to be dumped into the subclavian veins right before the subclavian veins merge together to form the superior vena cava. So lymph nodes are little organs of the lymphatic system, and they are going to help to protect your body by removing foreign material, things like bacteria and viruses and tumor cells, from the lymphatic stream. And they also are going to house special cells of immunity called lymphocytes. As the lymph is transported toward the heart, it is going to be filtered through thousands of lymph nodes that are clustered along those lymphatic vessels. There are large clusters of lymph nodes that are found in certain areas of the body. There's a large cluster that's located in the neck. Those are called the cervical lymph nodes. There's a large cluster that's found in the armpit. Those are the axillary lymph nodes. And there are a large collection that we find in the groin, and those are called the inguinal lymph nodes. Now, inside of those lymph nodes, we have white blood cells called macrophages. And macrophages are they're kind of generalists in the way that they remove pathogens from the body. They basically will just engulf and destroy any foreign substances that are found in the lymph before it is returned to the blood. But the lymphocytes are more of our specialists. They're like, the Navy SEALs. And so they are going to respond to specific foreign substances in our lymphatic stream. So here you can see the cervical lymph nodes that are located in the neck. There's a large cluster in the neck. And when you go to the doctor and your doctor, kind of palpates underneath your jaw and down into your neck, and they're looking for swollen glands, what they're actually palpating for are enlarged lymph nodes. Because when you're fighting an infection, those lymph nodes are going to enlarge because the lymphatic cells are increasing in number in those lymph nodes. We also have the axillary lymph nodes that are located in the armpit, and then we have our inguinal lymph nodes that are located in the groin. Now, most of our lymph nodes are going to be kind of kidney shaped, right? Shaped like a kidney bean, and they're less than an inch long. Each lymph node, when you look at it underneath the microscope, is going to be divided up into two regions. There's an outer cortex, just like we saw with the brain. The outer layer is called the cortex. And the cortex is going to contain follicles. And follicles are going to be dense collections of some of our lymphocytes. Those follicles are going to have a germinal center. So it's kind of a lighter staining central region of the follicles where B cells will multiply and form what we call plasma cells. And plasma cells are mature B cells that are secreting antibodies in response to some foreign invader. The outer cortical cells are going to be T cells that are going to circulate continuously between the blood, the lymph node, the lymphatic stream. And so they're more mobile, right? They're going to move throughout your blood, your lymphatic stream, your tissue spaces, because they're actually seeking out their specific foreign invader. Whereas the B cells kind of wait for it to come to them, the T cells are kind of on the hunt for things that don't belong. And then we have the medulla. So we have the cortex of the lymph node, and there's an inner medulla. And the inner medulla of the lymph node is going to contain our phagocytic macrophages. So those kind of generalist white blood cells that will basically just engulf anything that doesn't belong. So here's a diagram of a lymph node. So it is shaped kind of like a kidney bean, right? So we have this convex outer surface and this concave inner surface. Many lymphatic vessels will attach to the lymph nodes. So you have multiple afferent vessels that are going to carry lymph towards the node, fewer efferent vessels that are going to transport lymph away from the node. The lymph node has an outer cortex, and the cortex is going to contain our follicles, and the follicles are going to be the dark purple things with the lighter center, and the germinal center is where our B cells will start to mitotically divide and create daughter cells. And then we have our medulla, and the medulla is going to be more of our generalist macrophages. So lymph is going to enter the lymph node through afferent lymphatic vessels, and then the lymph is going to leave the lymph node via efferent lymphatic vessels. Now, the flow of lymph through a lymph node is really slow, and that's since there are more vessels that carry lymph toward the lymph node and fewer that carry lymph away from the lymph node, it causes there to be like a backlog of flow inside of the lymph node. So it's kind of like when you're driving down the interstate and there's construction and they take 4 lanes of traffic and they narrow it down to 2, right? So if you have 4 afferent vessels but only 2 efferent vessels, things kind of back up. And that's actually good, right? It's good for that lymph to kind of slowly percolate its way through the lymph node because it gives ample time for the macrophages to do their cleansing function and for the lymphocytes to detect the foreign invaders. Now, the lymph nodes help rid the body of infectious agents and cancer cells, but lymph nodes can get overwhelmed by these agents. When large numbers of bacteria or viruses are trapped in the nodes, they become inflamed, they swell up, and they're tender to the touch. So again, that's when your doctor is, kind of feeling around, particularly if you have like a head cold, she'll kind of palpate those lymph nodes in the neck to see if you're actually fighting a major infection. Lymph nodes can become secondary cancer sites if tumor cells survive within them. So, you may know somebody that had a cancerous tumor removed, and what they usually do is they will go to the closest lymph nodes, remove those as well to see if the cancer has metastasized or spread to the lymph nodes. If those closer lymph nodes are clean, they usually feel pretty good about the fact that whether or not they got all of those cancer cells. So again, we have several afferent vessels that carry the lymph towards the node, but only a few that carry the lymph away from the node. And so that causes the lymph to kind of stagnate inside of the lymph node, so there's ample cleansing time. Now, lymph nodes are just one organ of the lymphatic system. We have other organs like the spleen, the thymus gland, the tonsils, and Peyer's patches. And there's also just going to be like small smatterings of lymphatic tissue that is spread through nearly all of our epithelial and connective tissues. A common feature of lymphoid tissue is there is a predominance of our reticular connective tissue. Remember when we did histology and we looked at lymphatic tissue pictures underneath the microscope, and it's the one that looks like the cherry blossom trees? That is going to be those reticular fibers. And remember the little purple staining cells, the ones that look like the cherry blossoms, those are the actual lymphocytes. And so we only find this in but only our lymph nodes are actually going to filter the lymph. We do have lymphatic tissue in other organs, but only lymph nodes filter the lymph. All right, so here are some of our other lymphoid organs. So we have the tonsils, and the tonsils form like a ring of lymphatic tissue in our pharynx. And so the pharynx is a tube that is shared by your respiratory tract and your digestive tract. So anything that's coming in through the nasal cavity or through the oral cavity is going to have a chance to be analyzed by those lymphocytes and macrophages that are in your tonsils. Then we have the thymus, and the thymus is going to be found just behind your sternum. It's most active when you are a child, and it kind of atrophies as you reach your adult years. We have the spleen, which is going to be found near the lateral curvature of the stomach. It's going to be found on the left-hand side of the abdominal cavity. We have Peyer's patches, which are just little scattered follicles that we find in the wall of the small intestine. And we have the appendix. And the appendix is going to be like a little tubular offshoot of the large intestine that also contains follicles that have immune cells and macrophages. So our next lymphoid organ is going to be the spleen. And the spleen is a very blood-rich organ that filters blood. The spleen is going to filter and cleanse the blood of bacteria, viruses, and other debris. It's located on the left-hand side of the abdominal cavity. The spleen is capable of destroying worn out red blood cells. They only live for between 100 and 120 days, and they can recycle some of their components, mainly the iron that we find in the hemoglobin. That's going to be recycled back to the bone marrow for newly developing red blood cells. The spleen also acts as a storage site for platelets, and it's also going to function as a blood reservoir. So your liver acts as a blood reservoir also, where you can hold a bit of, not really extra blood, but some of the blood. In a fetus, the spleen is the only important hematopoietic site. So remember, hematopoiesis is the formation of blood cells. So in a fetus, our blood cells are mainly going to develop in the spleen, but the adult spleen only functions in storing lymphocytes. It no longer has hematopoietic characteristics. That's going to be the red bone marrow. Our next lymphoid organ is called the thymus gland, and the thymus gland is going to be a lymphoid mass that we find posterior to the sternum that produces hormones. Now, the thymus is going to peak during your childhood years. So really about the time that you start school to about the time that you graduate from high school, that's when you're going to be encountering most of your antigens or foreign substances. So that's when your thymus is most active. It is going to produce hormones like thymosin that are going to play a role in the development of T cells. So B cells make antibodies. T cells play a different role in immunity. They actually seek out cells that are already infected with viruses or intracellular bacteria, or they can also fight cancer cells. The tonsils are going to be those small masses of lymphoid tissue that protect the throat against pathogens. The tonsils, the tissue is actually arranged to where they have these deep crevices called tonsillar crypts. And those crevices are going to trap and remove bacteria or other foreign pathogens and prevent them from entering the throat. The tonsils are going to ring your pharynx, where they are found in the mucosal layer. Tonsillitis is when the tonsils become congested with bacteria and they become red and swollen and sore. Sometimes people will have to have a tonsillectomy when that infection gets severe and it impedes the ability to breathe or swallow. And then we have our Peyer's patches, and the Peyer's patches are going to function similarly to tonsils. Since they are found in the wall of the small intestine, their function is to capture bacteria that's in our digestive tract and prevent it from penetrating the intestinal wall, right? We don't want to breach the intestinal wall and get into the abdominal cavity. Both Peyer's patches and tonsils are part of a collection of little small lymphoid tissues that are collectively referred to as mucosa-associated lymphatic tissue. And that anagram spells out MALT, mucosa-associated lymphatic tissue. So MALT are these collections of lymphoid follicles. They're going to be found in the upper respiratory and digestive tracts, and they're going to be found in the upper respiratory tract and in the digestive tract, and they are going to kind of continuously attack any foreign matter that enters the body. Okay, so those are the tissues of our lymphatic system. So now we're going to look at body defenses. So then we're moving more into immunity. Now, our body is constantly in contact with bacteria and fungi and viruses. Our skin is colonized. We have bacteria growing on our skin. We have viruses. We have fungal spores. And our skin is really a great barrier that prevents those things from being able to actually enter our deeper tissues. Our body has two defense systems that are going to basically protect us from anything that is foreign and trying to get inside. We have the innate or non-specific defenses, and then we have the adaptive or specific defense system. So immunity is just the term that we use to specific resistance to disease. So we have the immune system. Underneath the immune system, we have the innate or non-specific defenses. And then we have the adaptive or specific defenses. Underneath the innate or non-specific defenses, we're going to have our first line of defense, which is intact skin and mucous membranes and their secretions. Right, so our skin is remarkably effective at keeping bacteria out until you cut yourself, right? That allows for the bacteria to get down into the deeper levels. So intact skin and mucous membranes and their secretions are going to just kind of cut things off at the pass, right? Prevent things from gaining entry at all into the body. Then we have our second line of defense, and the second line of defense is going to be internal, but again, these are going to be more of the generalists, right? If you think about your third line of defense is like the Navy SEALs and the mercenaries, those are like the specialists. Our second line of defense is just more generalists. These are, just the soldiers in the army. And that's going to include things like phagocytic cells. There's a special type of cell called a natural killer cell. We have internal antimicrobial proteins that are produced, and inflammation is also going to be a second line of defense. But then if something gets past all of that, then we have our third line of defense, which is the adaptive or specific immune system. And this is where our lymphocytes, our B cells and T cells come into play, the antibodies that are secreted by the B cells, and then we have another type of cell called an antigen presenting cell. And it's going to play an important role in actually preparing our T cells for the fight. So our body defenses fall into one of two categories. We have the innate or non-specific defense system, and this mechanism is going to protect us against a variety of invaders. Basically, if it's not self, then your body's going to mount an immune response to it. And so it's going to respond immediately to protect the body from foreign materials. Then we have the adaptive or specific defense system. And so the specific defense system is going to be required for each individual type of invader. So E. coli versus Salmonella versus the chickenpox virus, right? Each one is going to get their own tailor-created response based on the molecular makeup of whatever that invading pathogen is. So let's go over our innate or non-specific body defenses first. So the non-specific defense system is going to respond immediately to protect the body from all foreign substances. We have our first line of defense, which is intact skin and mucous membranes. Then we have inflammation, antimicrobial proteins, and our phagocytic cells. And so the non-specific defense system, its main job is to prevent entry and spread of microorganisms throughout the body. So it's almost like like with a prison, they usually have like two sets of fences around a prison, right? The outer perimeter fence would be like our skin and mucous membranes. And then there's like a gap of, I don't know, 10 or 20 feet. And then they have another internal fence, right? So in this case, if a prisoner was trying to get out, it would have to cross over both fences. Or if somebody was trying to get in, I don't know why you would want to get into prison, but if you had to get in, you would have to go over two fences in order to get in. So our first line of defense is skin and mucous membranes, right? So they are going to, first of all, prevent the entry of disease-causing microorganisms. And when your skin and your mucous membranes are intact, they are remarkably efficient at keeping us healthy. We really don't have to worry about disease until something breaches those barriers. In addition to serving as a physical barrier, these membranes are also going to produce a variety of protective chemicals. The skin has a low pH, right? The sweat and the oils that are produced by the skin have a low pH, and so they inhibit bacterial growth. Sebum, which is the oil, is also going to contain a chemical that is toxic to bacteria. So we're preventing the colonization of the skin by microorganisms. Other mucous membranes in females, the vagina is going to have secretions that are very low in pH, so they're very acidic, and that's going to prevent bad bacteria from being able to colonize. Your mucosa of your stomach secretes hydrochloric acid and protein digesting enzymes. Both of those kill pathogens. Saliva from the salivary glands and tears from your lacrimal glands are going to contain something called lysozyme, and lysozyme is an enzyme that can destroy bacteria. Mucus doesn't really kill bacteria directly, but it's thick and sticky, and so microorganisms get trapped, and then the cilia can kind of beat and carry those to areas of the body where they can either be spit out, or you can swallow them, and then your digestive enzymes in your stomach will break them down from there. So it prevents the entry of the pathogens into more delicate areas like the lungs. Then we have our second line of defense. So the first line of defense is intact skin and mucous membranes and their secretions. Now, if something gets past that first fence, right, if somebody climbs over the first fence, they still have to get past the second fence before they can get in or out, right? So our second line of defense is going to include things like fever, and we're also going to have some non-specific protections that are going to help to prevent and reduce damage from pathogenic invasions. Like, they might still happen, but they're not going to be as damaging. So one of the cells that plays a role in our second line of defense is going to be our phagocytes. And phagocytes are going to include both macrophages and neutrophils. These are capable of engulfing pathogens that have made their way past our primary barrier, right? Our intact skin and mucous membranes. So here is electron microscopy of a macrophage in purple. They have these long cytoplasmic appendages that are capable of capturing things like bacteria, right? And so they're going to draw that bacteria into the macrophage's body, and then they're going to break it down using our little lysozymes, which are the enzymes that we find inside of our organelles. Our next cell that plays a role in the second line of defense is called a natural killer cell, and sometimes it's referred to as an NK cell. And NK cells can lyse, that means cause them to burst, can lyse and kill cancer cells and cells that are infected with viruses. They are not phagocytic, so they don't engulf, but they secrete substances onto the surface of the cell that actually kills them. So they will attack a target cell's membrane and release chemicals which cause that membrane to disintegrate. The next component of our second line of defense is going to be inflammatory response, or just inflammation. So this is a non-specific response that's triggered whenever body tissues are injured or stressed. It occurs in response to physical trauma, intense heat, irritating chemicals, infections by viruses, and infections by bacteria. So anytime you get like that redness that occurs, the 4 cardinal signs of inflammation are going to be redness, heat, swelling, and pain. So even a bad sunburn is considered to be inflammation, right? It's red, it's hot, sometimes it's kind of swollen, and there's pain, obviously. So let's say that you cut your finger on a broken glass. The cells that are damaged when you cut yourself, they are going to release inflammatory chemicals, things called kinins and histamines. Those kinins and histamines are going to affect the surrounding tissue. The blood vessels in the area of the damage are going to dilate, and when they dilate, there's going to be increased blood flow to that area. So increased blood flow is going to bring about redness because you can see more of the blood in the capillaries, and it brings about the heat, right? Because blood is warmer than body temperature. The capillaries become leaky, and so more of the fluid leaks out of the capillaries into the interstitial space. And so that's what brings about the swelling. And if the swollen tissues are pressing on a nerve fiber, that can lead to pain. So the redness, heat, swelling, and pain, that are the 4 cardinal signs of inflammation, come from these inflammatory chemicals that are released by damaged or stressed tissue cells. So what is the function of inflammatory response, right? We know that you get inflammation from, dilated, leaky blood vessels, but what's the purpose? Well, the first thing we're going to do is it's going to help to prevent the spread of damaging agents to nearby tissues. When that fluid leaves those leaky capillaries, it's going to carry like clotting proteins with it. And those clotting proteins can kind of wall off the area where the tissues have been damaged. And so it kind of helps prevent the spread of those invading pathogens to nearby areas. Also, that fluid that leaks out is going to kind of sweep any bacteria or viruses and cellular debris. It's going to kind of sweep that into the lymphatic system. And so it can be cleansed as it works its way through our lymphatic vessels. And it's going to set the stage for repair. Now, inflammatory chemicals like histamine and kinins are going to trigger vasodilation. Vaso means vessel. Dilation means to increase in diameter. And that is going to signal phagocytes and other leukocytes to come to the area where the tissue injury has taken place. That's called chemotaxis. So our white blood cells are going to kind of follow a chemical trail, just like a bloodhound can follow a scent, right? The white blood cells are following this trail of inflammatory chemicals so that they know where to go, where this injury to the tissues has taken place. Those chemicals are also going to activate pain receptors, and that's the pain that we feel. Now, usually when you first injure a tissue, our neutrophils are going to be the first white blood cells to show up. That's because they're most abundant. They make up like 70% of our circulating white blood cells. So they're going to be the first ones to arrive, and they'll get in there and they'll start like phagocytizing, right? You know, gobbling up bacteria and cellular debris. But they really don't live very long. I'm sorry, I forgot this part. So in order to get out of the capillary and into the tissue space where the tissues have been injured, white blood cells can do this kind of neat trick called diapedesis. And what that means is they can squeeze in between the endothelial cells that make up the inner lining of the blood vessels. So they can like leave blood circulation and enter the tissue spaces. They just squeeze between the endothelial cells. And that way they can get to where they are most needed. Now, if an inflamed area contains a pathogen that has previously invaded the body, the third line of defense is going to come into play. So this is our specific or adaptive immunity. And this is an immune response that is mediated by our lymphocytes, in which both protective antibodies are produced by B cells, and where T cells invade the area to act specifically against a damaging agent. All right, so let's say you step on a nail, right? You just are a needle, right? So you're going to damage these tissues, and the tissues are going to release these inflammatory chemicals, these kinins and histamine. And so these chemicals kind of form a gradient, right? They're higher where they're being produced, and they get lower and lower and lower. So the neutrophils that are in our bloodstream, what's going to happen is they're going to be able to detect the presence of these inflammatory chemicals in the nearby tissues that have been damaged. And that is when they can undergo diapedesis, right? They can squeeze between the endothelial cells, and they will migrate towards the site of tissue injury. And that's where they can start acting like a phagocytic cell, right? They can engulf bacteria that have been introduced on the nail. They can phagocytize the debris of the cells that were damaged. Another component of our second line of defense is going to be antimicrobial proteins. And we have two different types. One type is going to attack microorganisms directly. Another type is going to inhibit the replication of microorganisms. So the two most important of our antimicrobial proteins are going to be complement proteins, and then there's one called interferon. Now, our complement proteins are going to be composed of these plasma proteins. There's about 20 different plasma proteins that circulate in an inactive state. They become activated when they are attached to foreign cells, things like bacteria, fungi, or mismatched red blood cells. And these complement proteins are going to cause lysis, or like breaking apart of these foreign cells. They also are going to promote phagocytosis. They enhance inflammation, so they enhance vasodilation and chemotaxis and phagocytosis. And so whenever we start this complement cascade reaction, it's going to produce these openings in the foreign cell's plasma membrane, and that allows for the water to flow into the cell and cause the cell to burst. So here is this is let's say the plasma membrane of a bacterium, right? They are going to have a phospholipid bilayer just like our cells do. but like antibodies will attach to this foreign bacterium's plasma membrane, and they will get these binding sites that align. And so these complement proteins will kind of start this cascade reaction where like the activation of the first is going to activate the second activates the third. And what happens is you wind up forming like a little rosette, a little ring of proteins in the plasma membrane of the bacterium, and that allows for the water to rush in. It allows for the cytoplasm to leak out, and then the cell just pops, right? You have this massive influx of water, and it causes the cell to pop. And then our second antimicrobial protein is called interferon. And interferon is going to be released by virus-infected cells. So viruses can't replicate on their own, right? They inject their genetic material into a host cell, and the host cell is going to act like an assembly line, right? It'll produce hundreds of copies of the viral genetic material and the viral proteins. So once a cell becomes infected with a virus, it's too late for that cell, but what it does is it will secrete these antiviral proteins that it will release, and those antiviral proteins will go into the neighboring cells. And those antiviral proteins that go into the neighboring cells, they help the neighboring cells to defend themselves against the virus. So like the one that's already infected, it's like, you know what, it's too late for me. There's nothing I can do about it, but I'm going to try and save my neighbors, right? So it produces these interferons. The interferons enter the neighboring cells that have not been infected, and so they can start producing their own antiviral proteins. Hi, Madison. I'm just lecturing ahead, hon, because I'm not going to be here on Wednesday or Thursday. So I'm lecturing through our lymphatic system, and I'm going to post it to OpenLMS and to YouTube. So you can stay if you want to, or you can just watch it once it's posted. You're welcome. And then our last of our non-specific defenses is fever, right? You'll run a fever regardless of if you have a virus or if you have a bacterial infection. So it's kind of a really generalized answer to anything that is invading body tissues. So fever is abnormally high body temperature, and it is a systemic response to any type of an invading microorganism. Your body temperature is regulated by the part of your brain called the hypothalamus. Remember, that's part of the diencephalon. The body temperature will increase in response to chemicals that are secreted by white blood cells, and they're called pyrogens. Pyro means fire, right? So a pyromaniac is somebody that likes to light fires, and gen means generating. So these chemicals are going to kind of reset your hypothalamic temperature, your hypothalamic thermostat to a higher level. Now, high fevers are dangerous because they can denature our enzymes that guide all of our metabolic pathways. Enzymes are proteins, right? Proteins are susceptible to high and low body temperatures. So if you have too much of a fever, then you'll start to unfold all of those important enzymes that regulate all of our metabolic pathways. But a mild to moderate fever is actually beneficial because it causes your spleen and your liver to take up or sequester zinc and iron. And zinc and iron are needed for bacteria to survive. So if your liver goes, nope, I'm taking all of that liver and that zinc, and it absorbs it and prevents it from being in circulation, then it's not there for the bacteria to use for replication. Fever also increases the metabolic rate inside of cells. It is going to speed up our defensive actions, and it speeds up the repair process. Okay, so I'm going to stop there for today. This is the first part of our chapter on the lymphatic system and immunity, and I will pick up in our next video with the adaptive or specific defense system.